was only one other child's bicycle there, that of a female 11 named Fiona. Jonas liked Fiona. She was a good student, quiet and polite, but she had a sense of fun as well, and it didn't surprise him that she was working with Asher today. He parked his bicycle neatly in the port beside theirs and entered the building. "Hello, Jonas," the attendant at the front desk said. She handed him the sign-up sheet and stamped her official seal beside his signature. All of his volunteer hours would be carefully tabulated at the Hall of Open Records. Once, long ago, it was whispered among the children, and 11 had arrived at the ceremony of 12, only to hear a public announcement that he had not completed the required number of volunteer hours and would not, therefore, be given his assignment. He had been permitted an additional month in which to complete the hours, and then given his assignment privately, with no applause, no celebration, a disgrace that had clouded his entire future. So here is we see one of our first ceremonies or traditions that when students are given their assignment, it happens with a lot of applause. And we can also see a rule that if you don't complete the required hours, then you are chastised or you are in trouble and disgraced. "It's good to have some volunteers here today," the attendant told him. "We celebrated a release this morning, and that always throws the schedule off a little, so things get backed up." She looked at a printed sheet. "Let's see. Asher and Fiona are helping in the bathing room. Why don't you join them there? You know where it is, don't you?" Jonas nodded, thanked her, and walked down the long hallway. He glanced into the rooms on either side. The old were sitting quietly, some visiting and talking with one another, others doing handwork and simple crafts. A few were asleep. Each room was comfortably furnished, the floors covered with thick carpeting. It was a serene and slow place, unlike the busy centers of manufacture and distribution where the daily work of the community occurred. "What do you think they're talking about here?" Yeah, you probably don't have many of these in Egypt. It's a retirement village. So when people become older, like grandmothers and grandfathers, they go live in these other places with other older people, and they relax and do crafts and sleep. Nowadays, they would watch TV. So this is where they're volunteering at today. Jonas was glad that he had, over the years, chosen to do his hours in a variety of places so that he could experience the differences. He realized, though, that not focusing on one area meant he was left with not the slightest idea, even a guess, of what his assignment would be. He laughed softly, thinking about the ceremony again. Jonas, he teased himself, but he suspected that with the date so near, probably all of his friends were too. He passed a caretaker, walking slowly with one of the old in the hall. "Hello, Jonas," the young uniformed man said, smiling pleasantly. The woman beside him, whose arm he held, was hunched over as she shuffled along in her soft slippers. She looked toward Jonas and smiled, but her dark eyes were clouded and blank. He realized she was blind. He entered the bathing room with its warm, moist air and scent of cleansing lotions. He removed his tunic, hung it carefully on a wall hook, and put on the volunteer's smock that was folded on a shelf. So these words, tunic and smock, describe types of shirts that are kind of plain, boring, not much shape. "Hi, Jonas," Asher called from the corner where he was kneeling beside a tub. Jonas saw Fiona nearby, at a different tub. She looked up and smiled at him, but she was busy, gently washing a man who lay in the warm water. Jonas greeted them and the caretaking attendants at work nearby. Then he went to the row of padded lounging chairs where others of the old were waiting. He had worked here before. He knew what to do. "Your turn, Larissa," he said, reading the name tag on the woman's robe. "I'll just start the water and then help you up." He pressed the button on a nearby empty tub and watched as the warm water flowed in through the many small openings on the side. The tub would be filled in a minute, and the water flow would stop automatically. He helped the woman from the chair, led her to the tub, removed her robe, and steadied her with his hand on her arm as she stepped in and lowered herself. She leaned back and sighed with pleasure. Her head was on a soft, cushioned headrest. "Comfortable?" he asked, and she nodded, her eyes closed. Jonas squeezed cleansing lotion onto the clean sponge at the edge of the tub and began to wash her frail body. So one of the things to think about here is that this is kind of a tradition, that when people get old, they go to this home and people who aren't their family care for them. My guess this is very different than what would happen in Egypt. How in Egypt are the elderly or old people treated? And would someone who is not a family member ever wash them? Although this is seen as a job, a good job maybe, in the giver, this is probably quite different from what you're used to. Last night, he had watched as his father bathed the new child. This was much the same. The fragile skin, the soothing water, the gentle motion of his hand, slippery with soap. The relaxed, peaceful smile of the woman's face reminded him of Gabriel being bathed. And the nakedness, too. It was against the rules for children or adults to look at another's nakedness. But the rule did not apply to new children or the old. Oh, and here you can see we have another rule. Is this the same or different than the rules in Egypt? And how? Jonas was glad. It was a nuisance to keep oneself covered while changing for games, and the required apology if one had by mistake glimpsed another's body was always awkward. He couldn't see why it was necessary. He liked the feeling of safety here in this warm and quiet room. He liked the expression of trust on the woman's face as she lay in the water, unprotected, exposed, and free. From the corner of his eye, he could see his friend Fiona help the old man from the tub and tenderly pat his thin, naked body dry with an absorbent cloth. She helped him into his robe. Jonas thought Larissa had drifted into sleep, as the old often did, and he was careful to keep his motions steady and gentle so he wouldn't wake her. He was surprised when she spoke, her eyes still closed. "This morning we celebrated the release of Roberto," she told him. "It was wonderful." "I knew Roberto," Jonas said. "I helped with his feeding the last time I was here, just a few weeks ago. He was a very interesting man." Larissa opened her eyes happily. "They told his whole life before they released him," she said. "They always do. But to be honest," she whispered with a mischievous look, Some of the tellings are a little boring. I've even seen some of the old fall asleep during tellings. When they released Edna recently. Did you know Edna? Jonas shook his head. He couldn't recall anyone named Edna. So, here's one of those words. Tellings. So, tellings are the telling of somebody's life or their biography. And that's how they celebrate when someone is going to be released. How might you celebrate? Or, what kind of thing would you call a telling? Often in English, we would call this an obituary. That has feelings that are more sad than the word tellings. Telling sounds kind of boring almost. Well, they tried to make her life sound meaningful. And of course, she said primly, all lives are meaningful. I don't mean that they aren't, but Edna, my goodness. She was a birth mother, and then she worked in food production for years, until she came here. She never even had a family unit.